science that includes practical activity. And as an aside, it's quite interesting in England that we've dropped the science tests for year 11, which was strictly, for the 11-year-olds, the national tests, because it was demonstrated that because they were pencil and paper tasks, children had stopped doing any practical science in their classrooms, and their actual level of scientific understanding had gone down over the last 10 years, even though their science scores had gone up. And I'll come back to that sort of finding again. The other area that we might decide to go up into is the between manageability and construct validity, let's say at 50 minutes. And I've heard some good and interesting presentations here about the idea of risking teachers assessing it in order to do a more valid assessment. Stuart Shaw was talking about the research project that students who are destined for top universities and the like are taking with the Cambridge Pre-U exam. The same is true for the International Baccalaureate, which has been doing this for longer, that students are asked to do a research project of their own choosing on the subject they want to do, and the teacher will mark this. Now that, in terms of construct validity, you'd say is very near to 12, because this is the student choosing a subject, developing their own research methods, and this is in preparation for university, where they'll be asked to do very similar kinds of work. So it's a good preparation, so the validity is high. It's teacher assessed, there'll be moderation and everything else, but where the compromise is, we can't have the same standards of reliability. From what Stuart was saying, they're not much different, actually. The teacher assessment and the assessments that went on were as reliable as many. But whatever we're doing, we've got this compromise, and my push today will be that we want to try and get the hand as near to 12 as possible if we want assessment that actually helps the learner carry skills forward. The second of these threats is the past paper tradition. This is a nice example from Garrison Keillor, the novelist, this imaginary Midwest town of Lake Woebegone, where the men are good looking, the women are strong, and all the children are above average. That's where we get the Lake Woebegone effect from, for those who are familiar with this. For years, students of the senior class were required to read Philippopolis and answer questions about its meaning. Teachers were not required to do so, but simply marked according to the correct answers supplied by Miss Quoist, including 1, to extend the benefits of civilization and religion to all people, 2, no, 3, Plato, and 4, a wilderness cannot satisfy the hunger for beauty and learning once awakened. The test was the same from year to year, and once the seniors found the answers and passed them to the juniors, nobody read Philippopolis anymore. And my question is, what construct is being assessed here? Let me move on to a more serious case. This is some good research on the very high stakes Texas assessment of academic skills. Gordon and Rees found that direct teaching to pass the test can be very effective, so much so that students could pass tests even though the students have never learned the concepts on which they are being tested. As teachers become more adept at this process, they can even teach students to answer correctly test items intended to measure students' ability to apply or synthesize, even though the students have not developed application, analysis, or synthesis skills. I think we're all the way. We could all provide examples of this, where the syllabus is so predictable that students can come in, cue certain answers, produce the stuff, and they may not have understood it. This is one from the inspector's report in England they went into maths classrooms. Exam results are better, but pupils do not carry number lessons into real life. Children are leaving school unable to apply maths in their everyday lives, despite exam results improving significantly over the past decade, Ofsted has judged. Pupils are drilled to pass tests instead of gaining a proper understanding of the subject. And I think, again, we're all familiar with that. But in terms of the double duty, this is a really good example of only doing the single duty. We're in the here and now. The students do not carry much forward into their lifelong learning. They've got through the test, but they haven't carried with them an understanding of what they're doing. I'm going to do one more example of this, a personal favourite. I want you to pay attention, please, because you'll have to join in the chorus. This is Medawus looked at some Irish examination papers for 11-year-olds and took papers from 3 consecutive years and picked out some papers. Here is a paper from the first year. It was a bicycle ride, was the essay title. I awakened early, jumped out of bed and had a quick breakfast. My friend Mary Quant was coming to the house at 9 o'clock and we were going for a long bicycle ride together. It was a lovely morning. White, fleecy clouds floated in the clear blue sky and the sun was shining. As we cycled over Castlemore Bridge, we could hear the babble of the clear stream beneath us. Away to our right, we could see the brilliant flowers in Mrs. Casey's garden. Early summer roses grew all over the pergola, which stood in the middle of the garden. That was the first year. The next year, there was an essay title called A Day in the Bog, A Day in the Marshes. Here's an opening paragraph from one of the essays for that. I awakened early and jumped out of bed. I wanted to be ready at 9 o'clock when my friend Sadie was coming to our house. Sadie said he would take us with him to the bog if the day was good, Daddy said. It was a lovely morning. The sun was shining and white fleecy clouds floated in the clear blue sky. As we were going over Castlemore Bridge in the horse and cart, we could hear the babble of the clear stream beneath us. Away to our right, we could see the brilliant flowers in Mrs. Casey's garden. Early summer roses grew all over the pergola, which stood in the middle of the green. So I want you to join in the chorus now for year 3. I awakened early, da-da-da-da-da-da. It was a lovely morning. The sun was shining, and white fleecy clouds floated in the clear blue sky. As we drove over Castlemere, we could hear the babble of the clear stream beneath us. From the bus window, we could see Mrs. Casey's early summer roses grew all over the pergola, which stood in the middle of the garden. I don't need to make much more of a meal of this, but this is the past paper tradition, where students, what are we validly assessing from students in those different years? So let me move on and very briefly look at some of the others. I'm not going to develop these, but the idea that grades become more important than knowledge or skills in these high accountability, high stakes assessment. A very telling quote from Ronald Dorr. In the process of qualification, the pupil is concerned not with mastery, but with being certified as having mastered. The knowledge that he gains not for its own sake, and not for constant use in a real-life situation, but for the once-for-all purpose of reproducing it in an examination. This is a failure of the double duty. Alan Hansen again, calls it the fabricating process of tests. Because tests act as gatekeepers to many educational and training programs, the likelihood that someone will be able to do something as determined by the tests becomes more important than actually being able to do it. And this is my point about the one-handed clock. If we are not producing valid tests that actually assess the construct that we want, we're giving certificates to people for who have not actually got the skills in those areas. An oversimplistic interpretation of results. Very little time on this. Equating, when governments and policymakers equate results with educational standards, so that improved results equal improved standards, we have a problem. Because what this leads to is schools playing the system. The job is to get better results, not to get better learning and knowledge in their students. We do everything we can, we play the system to try and improve our results. We become less concerned about what has been learned. So let me get on to some suggestions for how I think we might improve this. Improving test dependability, making the double duty clearer. The first, I think, is the idea of making explicit the purpose and learning demands. And it's as radical as I get, I make the radical point, it should be the aims of the course rather than its content that should determine the purpose and form of assessment. Many of us here have got both exam syllabuses, but also national curriculums, which have goals and aims very much in terms of individual creativity, a lot of self-words. I heard some of the Singapore curriculum, Hong Kong curriculums, the same with the English curriculum, when they finally got round to putting aims in it. And this is the idea that it will help the student become a creative learner, an independent learner, working in groups. These are the aims. I think from my experience, what happens when as examiners we're setting up an examination, we look at the content of the curriculum rather than the aims. If we are really interested in students being creative, self-directed, interested in the subject, wouldn't we assess in a different way? So there's this, my pressure is how do we make explicit the purpose, how do we address that purpose? And the idea of learning demand taxonomies, Bloom, Solo, there are others, I'm not developing that. But when we develop an exam, we ought to be thinking, if it's to be valid, if the purpose of this exam is to encourage students to become self-confident learners and the like, how does our exam address this? How does our test encourage this in the learner? So it sounds like a small move, but actually going back to what are the aims of this curriculum and how do we assess in order to do justice to these aims, I think is an important and difficult step. My second is the idea of moving to principled knowledge through less predictable questions. And again, I've worked at an exam board and I've worked with a national agency. Suddenly changing a question would create all sorts of bother. Because we have a past paper tradition, you're not allowed too many surprises in an exam paper, or there will be all sorts of trouble. Good example from QCA, I think some of the test developers may be here, that quite legitimately, as its stimulus material for the reading on the national test, 1 year, it had been 3 years of kind of newspaper media sorts of presentations, nice fold-out newspaper stimulus materials. In the 4th year, they just used a simple poem. And they had to recruit additional telephonists to deal with the complaints. Because teachers were ringing up and saying, that's totally unfair. We had prepared our students for newspaper. I've got students crying in my room. People are very upset. It was in the curriculum. It was something that could have been asked, but the past paper tradition was a problem there. They were not prepared for it. So I'd like to move from the idea of teachers talking about when you see this, do that. Instructing their students, cueing them, when you see this, you know it's about this, do this. I would like examination papers where teachers have to say, what if there was this? What if this came up? Or what if this came up? How would you deal with this? In other words, pushing the students to think about their knowledge, organize their knowledge so that they can be more flexible. Again, I see that as a difficult task. Eva Baker from the States says perhaps what we should do is announce it that in one topic of the paper we are going to ask some different questions this year. Prepare yourself. But you can only prepare by being better at understanding the topic so that you can face a new kind of question. If you're drilled, you will panic when you see a new kind of question. So we're trying to get away from drilling. That would be another suggestion. Provide more challenging exemplars in new and revised examination. Again, I've been involved, as many of you are, with constructing new exams. One of the risks of these is you go through all the specifications, what it will do, the weightings and all this, and then at the end you think, oh, we've got to put some exemplar material out and we've left it very late. Let's just dash off some exemplar material. And so it's often the weakest bit of the new syllabus. Very quickly constructed exemplar materials. The problem is you're stuck with them because in the first year of the exam, you must do something similar to your exemplar materials. Otherwise, schools would say, that's not fair. You told us it was going to be like this, and now you've done something different. So my push here would simply be say, if we're doing a new syllabus, let's work really hard on the exemplars and make them a lot more challenging and requiring the kind of principled knowledge, sending the signal to schools that this is what we'll need. We'll need students who can think if they get something in a different form. This links to formative assessment as well, and my push here would be to say one of our problems in examination classrooms is that all we do is mimic the external exam. We give our students test after test from past papers, the sorts of questions you get, and that kind of thing. On our clock, teacher assessment can always be nearer 12 than external assessment. We don't have to care the same amount about the reliability. We can make it manageable ourselves. So we can be riskier with the kinds of things we ask. And this would be good formative assessment. Get at the misunderstandings. Show where somebody really understands. Analyze what they don't understand. That kind of thing. So that's the second way. In terms of the idea of just having a correct answer, I want to quickly look at this is true. This was an account from the Scientific American some years back of a student who'd put in an appeal during his university exams because he got 0 for a question and he was demanding full marks. And the question was, show how it is possible to determine the height of a tall building with the aid of a barometer. And the student's answer was, take the barometer to the top of the building, attach a long rope to it, lower it to the street, and then bring it up, measuring the length of the rope. The length of the rope is the height of the building. Now, the examiner gave him 0 for this, but he appealed, so they called in another science, a professor in the department. He said, could you get, it's correct, that's how you get the height of the building using a barometer, but it doesn't show much knowledge of physics. So the student was invited and given 6 minutes to write a more physics-like answer to this. He sat there for 5 minutes and did nothing. So the worried second examiner said, can't you think of anything? And he said, no, I can think of lots of things. I'm just choosing which one to write down. So in the end, he dashed off, take the barometer to the top of the building and lean over the edge of the roof. Drop the barometer, timing its fall with a stopwatch. Then using the formula S equals a half AT, calculate the height of the building. Which isn't what the exam was expecting. You know what a barometer sort of question, you know how you're supposed to answer a barometer sort of question about pressures and the like. I asked my colleague if he would give up. He conceded and gave the student almost full credit. But I recall that he said he had some other answers to the problem, and I asked them what they were. There are many ways of getting the height of a tall building with the aid of a barometer. You could take the barometer out on a sunny day, measure the height of the barometer, the length of the shadow of the building, use simple proportion to determine the height of the building. And others? Oh, if you want to be more sophisticated, he said, you tie the barometer to the end of a string, swing the pendulum, determine the value of G at street level and at the top of the building. From the difference between the two values of G, the height of the building in principle can be calculated. And then the student, this is my favorite bit, we've been building to this. If you don't limit me to physics solutions, there are many other answers, such as saying to the superintendent of the building, if you will tell me the height of this building, I will give you this barometer. At this point, the student was asked if he really didn't know the answer. He admitted that he did, but he was fed up with teachers trying to lead him to think that there was one single answer to every question. He suggested, and rightfully so, that critical thinking ought to include the notion that divergent answers are possible for almost any problem. And I think that leaves us with this duty of how we offer principle, how we tap into principle knowledge, how we cope with somebody who does understand but doesn't play the game quite as we want to. The third is keep the assessment as authentic as possible. This is my notion of construct validity, where you are assessing what you claim you're assessing. You're assessing the actual performance, if you can, or what represents the skill there. You are as close as you can be to this. And the idea of producing a systemically valid test, this is a useful notion, one that induces in the education system curricular and instructional changes that foster the development of the cognitive skills that the test is designed to measure. In other words, you come away, if you do well in the task, you've come away with the very skills that the task claims it's assessing, and it forces the teaching into addressing these very skills. So this is the double duty writ large here. This is what we mean by the double duty, that the student comes away with learning he can take forward. The teacher shapes classroom teaching and learning to develop these skills as well, because the test is requiring these skills. It also makes the idea that grades don't represent, grades are more important than the knowledge. We try and make a better link between the grade and the knowledge. You only have a good grade if you really understand this. That's the hope in this particular way forward. Just the reminder here that what we are trying to do all the time is push the hand back up in one direction or another above. We don't want it in the 20 to 40. We want it as near to 12 as we can get it. Because then we're confident that we're actually assessing what we claim we're assessing. We're not assessing something else. We're not assessing a diminished version of what we're looking at. I'm moving very rapidly through these next one, but a concern for those of us with accountability systems that are very much based on exam and test results. We've always got this problem of schools and everywhere else having to maximize their results in order to look good in the accountability scheme. And the pressure here is to make better use of assessment data to encourage what Honora O'Neill has called intelligent accountability. Just going to pick out one or two of these. The first one I think is important. Set realistic targets. Many of us are in cultures where our government, our policymakers set what I've called aspirational targets. They're not based on anything, it's just we would like in England 85% of students to be at level 4 at age 11. In the United States, they have an even more draconian with No Child Left Behind, where they've said in 2014, every child must be basically competent in literacy and numeracy, which most of us would say is an impossible target. It's an aspirational target. My point would be those of us who can influence policymakers, and the policymakers here might take away, why shouldn't we set empirical targets, ones that are grounded in what Bob Lynn calls an existence proof, In other words, somebody has actually met this target. The very best schools have been able to do this. So that might be a realistic target for other schools. If nobody has met this target, why are we setting it? And Bob Lynn has pointed out that in terms of getting to everybody competent in 2014, the rate of improvement per year in grade 4 maths is going to have to be 4 times faster than the total increase over the period 1996 to 2003. So every year we're going to have to work, we're going to have 4 times better results than for a whole 7-year period of progress. In grade 8 maths, that goes up to over 7 times the rate of improvement over the total 7 years per year up to 2014. And this becomes, again, these kinds of targets actually begin to subvert the system, because schools have to play all sorts of games and local authorities have to play all sorts of games to meet these targets. And this is not in the service of learning. This is the way that accountability drives can sometimes corrupt the learning process. Use multiple measures to reduce distortion. We again, some cultures, certainly like the English, rely very heavily on exam results as the key measure of whether a school is successful or not. And the Honora O'Neill thing would be, we ought to be using much more sophisticated measures. In exam terms, it could be value added, but we also need to look at student satisfaction, attendance rates, all sorts of other factors to say, is this school making good progress? At the moment, it's very much down to they improved their exam results by 5% this year, they are making good progress. We need to be cleverer, we need to be more intelligent about our accountability systems than that. Alistair Pollitt, who unfortunately is not here this year, has the lovely analogy of the Swiss Army penknife. Are you familiar with the Swiss Army penknife? It's the one with all the blades and toothpicks and corkscrews and everything else. He makes the point that the Swiss Army penknife does everything but does nothing well. And this is the problem when you start to use exam results for too many purposes. Paul Newton is here, who is our purpose spotter in England, has pointed out that in the national curriculum we use the results for at least 14 different purposes. And this is the Swiss Army penknife. You don't do anything well if you're using it for so many purposes. It can't do every purpose equally well. My own thought about that is if you've got a Swiss Army penknife or seen one, it has a saw on it. And it is the feeblest saw you've ever seen, but it's got a saw. And just imagine you're out in the forest and a tree falls on you and you think, oh good, and your leg's trapped. You think, oh good, I'll use my Swiss Army penknife to saw through this tree. You'd be found dead with exhaustion in about 12 hours. The blade's this long and you'd be going like this and you wouldn't last. So the idea that we can take a test result and then use it for accountability, reporting to parents, selection, this, that and the other, we can use it, but we're not going to do everything equally well, and some things we do downright badly. That's the idea of monitoring national standards separately. The idea that a government can announce standards have risen because this year's test results have improved has been really proved not to be the case, both from work in the states, the NAEP, the national monitoring systems say, no, there may have been progress, but it's nothing like the progress reported by the tests. The tests distort it, yet sometimes politicians, policymakers take it at face value. We have to get away from that. Let me finally just come back to formative assessment. I've been talking about exams. I've been trying to suggest that in order to do the double duty, to help